Hi, everyone. We're continuing our discussion of newsworthiness today by talking about human interest and human interest stories. Human interest covers a lot of ground, so we're going to talk about different aspects of human interest. And we're also going to talk about how you can add human interest into any kind of news story. But first, a quick recap from last time. I talked about news judgment, the decisions that journalists and editors and producers make about what gets covered in the news and what doesn't. And there are different criteria of newsworthiness that are used to help make the decisions. What makes a story worth reporting as news? There are a number of criteria that are pretty common in journalism around the world. One of them is prominence or significance of who's involved in the story or where the story is taking place. Another one is proximity. People are more interested in stories that happen close by than stories that happen far away. Another criterion is timeliness. Obviously, the news should be about what's happening now or even what's happening next, not what happened last week or last month or last year. Other criteria are negativity or positivity. Obviously, bad news is pretty common in journalism. But people also like to seek out positive news stories about good things that happen or good people making the news. Conflict makes for a popular news story. Conflict is a tricky one because sometimes journalists will introduce conflict where there really isn't any in order to make their story seem more exciting or interesting. And then finally, stories about things that are rare or novel or strange are often more popular than stories about ordinary events or ordinary people. So if something is particularly rare or strange or new, it will get more attention from journalists. These decisions about what to include and what not to include, what to cover and what not to cover, can introduce an element of subjectivity in news reporting. The minute you decide not to include certain information, you're not giving the whole story, so you're not being objective. But these standard criteria of newsworthiness can help you make decisions about what to include and what not to include, because these are things that are common to journalism throughout the world. Obviously, every news organization has its own criteria. So when you work as a journalist, you'll find out what kinds of stories your news organization tends to tell, and you'll focus on those stories. For today, the homework was to read the section on human interest, the grab bag criterion, in the Knight text, pages 40 to 42. So the question is, why is human interest a grab bag? A grab bag as an expression means something that kind of can cover almost anything, can contain almost anything. And human interest certainly covers a lot of ground. And a question I asked you too is, what effect does the pursuit of human interest have on the news? So these are the questions that we'll be thinking about and talking about in today's lecture. But first, we should probably define human interest so we have an understanding of what it means. A standard dictionary definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary: a quality that attracts attention because it involves the experiences of real people. So anytime that you're adding account of something happening to an individual or a group of people into your story, you're adding human interest. Human interest stories attract attention because people like stories about people. And as you can imagine, human interest covers a wide range of topics. You can have straight news stories that have an element of human interest because they focus on an individual. Or you can have more celebrity-oriented news stories that focus on somebody famous or somebody important that gets a lot of attention. Human interest stories can also focus on ordinary people as well. So this is just a sample of 3 stories from the New York Times, October 29th, 2019. There's one story where the headline is "Meet the Army Colonel Who's Testifying About Trump's Phone Call." And this is a focus on a particular individual in the investigation into Trump's phone call to the president of Ukraine as part of the impeachment proceedings, or leading into potentially the impeachment proceedings. But it's giving you more information about the individual who's testifying, the Army colonel who has the information about Trump's phone call. Another story was "Finding a Niche Was Hard, Then She Found a Career." And this was about someone who immigrated to the United States and was really struggling to find a place here and to get a job. She took a job training course and found a career that enabled her to make a good life for herself here. And then finally, there's the story "Jason Reynolds is on a Mission," which is about a performer who is on a mission to help African American students to succeed. So these are all examples of human interest stories. Again, they can be straight news stories that focus on a particular individual. They can be stories about ordinary people, like immigrants who are making their way in the United States. Or they can be stories about performers and other celebrities who are doing things that people might be interested in finding out more about. Human interest is the subject of a fair amount of debate. Often human interest stories are perceived as being kind of trivial or kind of fluff, right? Stories about celebrities, stories about cheerleaders, might not be seen as the most important topics for professional journalism. And that often debates about human interest revolve around the question of whether you give your audience what they want or what they need. Or another way of phrasing it is, do you write to be popular or to be professional? Now, there's an assumption here that people tend to want stories that are not so important, and people tend to need stories that are important, and that there's a difference between what people want and what they need. I think that this is often exaggerated. I think often people do want serious news, and they do want to know what's going on. They want to know what their government is up to. They want to know how the economy is doing. And so there is a real desire for hard news stories. But audiences are also attracted to stories about celebrities and stories about people who might not otherwise seem important from a news point of view. Another way of thinking about your story is to think about it in terms of impact. So the question there is, what do people need to know? Right? Stories about celebrities may be popular, but news needs to cover all topics because people need to know about a wide variety of things in order to function well in society. So one way of thinking about using human interest to your advantage as a journalist is to think about adding human interest to any kind of news story. So you can take a story that's about a boring topic like taxes or new traffic regulations and ask yourself, who does this story impact? What kind of people does it affect and how does it affect them? And in answering that question, you're adding an element of human interest into your straight news story and therefore making it more relatable to your audience and maybe more interesting for them. An especially good application of this is to think about who your audience is and what they're interested in and think, how does this affect them? If you can lead your story with an example of how the news has an impact on them, then they are more likely to be interested in it and to read it. So to summarize, giving your audience what they want and giving them what they need may be very different things, but they also may be, the difference between those things may be exaggerated, right? Because often people do want straight news and they do want to know what's going on. So thinking about celebrity stories versus a more general understanding of human interest is also important. Obviously, celebrity stories are easy to write, and they do get lots of hits online. People are always curious about what's going on with their favorite celebrities, and if they see something, they will click on it and try to get more information. But human interest doesn't just mean celebrities or even important people more generally. What happens to ordinary people is interesting too. So asking, who does this story impact, gives your story a human focus, even if it is about a boring topic like taxes or new traffic laws or things like that. Right, so it can be very easy to write stories about celebrities, or as the textbook points out, about children or pets. But human interest covers a lot more ground than that. You can approach almost any topic with an element of human interest. So thinking about, for example, stories about air pollution in Ulaanbaatar, often those stories lead in with something about a specific family or even children in the hospital or things like that that give a human side to the story and make it more relatable to the news audience. So human interest can cover a lot of ground, and that's why the author of the text, Robert Knight, considers it to be a grab bag criterion for newsworthiness. So one example is looking at immigration stories in the U.S. news. Right now, there are a lot of stories about immigration, and there have been for at least over the past year. Because of family separation policy that was happening and that continues to happen when people are seeking asylum in the United States and children are separated from their parents. You can report on this topic in a variety of ways. You could approach it strictly in terms of statistics. There have been a lot of stories now circulating about just how many children have been separated from their families. A new figure that emerged is 5,400 children have been affected by this. And so you can approach it in a very kind of objective, fact-based statistical way, which might be interesting for some people who are, motivated by finding out about facts. But another way to approach this topic is to look at what's happening to individuals or small groups of people and how they are affected by it. This has the advantage of giving your audience a chance to put themselves in the shoes of people who are experiencing this, and to see what it must feel like to have this happen to them. Of course, this is highly subjective. It doesn't have the objective feel of statistics and facts, but it can make a very complicated, very difficult story like immigration much easier to understand from the point of view of someone who's never experienced it, and doesn't know anyone who's in this situation. So one example of this was CNN's recent story from October 25th. There's a video. There's a link to it here in the slide. The story headline was How One Migrant Family Was Reunited After Detention. And this kind of headline, it contains good keywords. If someone's searching for stories about migrants or migrant family, they'll hit this story. And if they're searching for migrant detention, they will also hit this story. So the headline itself contains a lot of good words that are useful for an online search, but it also indicates that it's going to give you the experience of one particular family and what it was like. If you watch the story, it does do that. It talks about a girl being reunited with her father. And the reason that she's being reunited is she just happened to turn 18 in detention. So this relates to the more general question of what happens to children in detention when they turn 18. They can no longer be held in the child detention facility, so they either have to be released to family members, as happened with this girl, or they get turned over to adult detention facilities and await deportation, usually. So it does answer a more general question of what happens to children when they turn 18. It also addresses the more general question of how families respond to being separated from each other at the U.S. border. So in this case, you get to see through this experience of this single family what it is like in general to be separated, how it feels, why it happens, how it happens, what the results are. Right? And then another general question that's addressed in this video is, why do people seek asylum in the United States? Not everybody understands this issue. And so explaining the issue a little bit through the story of this individual family might give someone a better idea of why this is happening in the first place. So that gets addressed in the story as well. So here you have a really good example of the connection between human interest and what happens to this one migrant family and serious general news about immigrant detention in the United States. So just to summarize, I talked about what is human interest. So in general, it's anything that relates the experience of real human beings. I talked about the debate about human impact, of human interest, and the discussion revolving around news people want versus news people need. And I talked about how human interest stories can get beyond celebrity news using the stories of ordinary people to get at serious news topics. And the important way to think about this is in terms of impact. If you ask yourself, who does this story impact? It's a way of introducing human interest into any kind of news story, and therefore giving your story a little bit of a boost with your audience, because it becomes more interesting and more relatable, because people basically do like stories about other people. If you've listened to the lecture up to this point, please send me a picture of a tree. It could be any kind of tree, but please send me a picture of a tree if you listened to the lecture up to now. Thank you. And for next time, we're going to continue discussing newsworthiness. I'll be talking about newsworthiness in print versus broadcast. Newsworthiness is slightly different for broadcast news than it is for print or for online news. So the assignment for next time is to read the section on newsworthiness for the eye and ear in the night text, pages 42 to 46. And think about the question, how does newsworthiness differ for television and radio broadcast? Also, a reminder that the draft of your 4th blog post is due on Monday, November 4th. So please start thinking about that and trying to get it in. And think about the criteria of newsworthiness that we've been talking about and which ones you might be able to address in your story. And here's a challenge for you to think of a human interest story to write about, or think about how you can add human interest to your stories. Most of you have already been doing this. I think almost all your stories involve an element of human interest. But maybe if you think about it a little bit more consciously, you can develop the human interest of your story even further. Another challenge there is to include information about real people, individuals or groups of people in your story by interviewing them or collecting other information about them and including that. So you don't have to write a human interest story. Again, you can write about any topic that you choose. But since we're talking about human interest, maybe that would be something to focus on. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I will catch you next time.